The courtroom on the fourth floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse smelled like old carpet and something close to cedar. I had been in rooms like this before, not as a party, but as the man who prepared the files that other people carried in. 31 years of private investigation work teaches you to read a room before anyone in it has said a word. I read this one from the second row of the gallery, and what I saw was my son rehearsing how to look calm. Cody sat at the petitioner's table with his attorney, a man named Greaves, who wore French cuffs and had the particular stillness of someone billing $400 an hour. I counted the number of times Greaves touched his left cufflink before the session was called to order. 7. Cody leaned toward him twice, each time saying something short, and each time Greaves nodded without changing expression. My son looked good. He always looked good in rooms like this. He had learned that from me, or thought he had. What he hadn't learned was the difference between looking prepared and being prepared. Through the narrow window set into the hallway door, I could see a woman sitting on the wooden bench outside. Gray coat, dark hair pulled back, hands folded together in her lap, not moving. She was not looking at the door, not looking at anything in particular. Her name was Renata Voss, and she had been waiting on that bench for 40 minutes. I knew this because I had arrived early, and I had watched her sit down. She hadn't looked toward the courtroom once. That told me everything I needed to know about where her decision stood. People who are still deciding look at doors. Renata was not looking at the door. 2 years ago, my son handed a doctor a paper and asked her to sign it. The paper said, among other things, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, my finances, my property, my medical decisions, the company I had built over 3 decades in commercial real estate. It said I needed a guardian. It named Cody as that guardian. I want to tell you what was actually on that paper and what my son did not know I had already done before the ink on his signature was dry. I looked at Cody one more time. He straightened his tie. He was still smiling, very slightly, the way a man smiles when he believes the outcome is already settled. I had seen that smile before, on other men, in other rooms. It never meant what they thought it meant. I turned back toward the hallway window. Renata had not moved. I had been a private investigator for 31 years. People assume that means car chases and hidden cameras, the way television tells it. What it actually means is patience. It means sitting in a parking lot for 6 hours watching a door that never opens, and knowing that the door not opening is itself a piece of information. It means understanding that what people do not say is usually more important than what they do. By the time I retired, in 2019 at 64 years old, I had built enough of a reputation in commercial real estate investigations that 3 firms in Portland still called me for consulting work. I declined all of them. Sylvia had been sick for 8 months by then, and there was nothing in any boardroom or courthouse in the state of Oregon that I wanted more than to be in the house on Dunmore Street when she woke up in the morning. Sylvia died 14 months after my retirement. Pancreatic cancer. She was 61 years old. She had wanted to repaint the back fence before the end of summer, the white picket section that ran along the garden she'd planted in 2003, and she never got to it. I didn't get to it either. The fence stayed unpainted for 2 years after she was gone. Some mornings, I would stand at the kitchen window and look at it and drink my coffee until it went cold. Cody was 34 when his mother died. He had her cheekbones and my stubbornness. And, for most of his life, that combination had served him reasonably well. I had paid for his undergraduate degree at Oregon State and his MBA at the University of Portland. When he came to me 3 years before Sylvia's death and said he wanted to work in commercial real estate, I brought him into Briggs Property Group as co-director. I gave him the leasing division. He was good at it. He had the kind of confidence that clients respond to, and he learned the market faster than I expected. I told him so. I was proud of him. That is the part I want to be clear about, because what came later could make a person forget that there was a before, a time when my son and I sat across from each other in the office on SWW 5th and talked about the business, and I believed, without reservation, that he was someone I had raised correctly. The first thing Cody said to me about my memory was in November, about 8 months after Sylvia's funeral. We were having dinner at his apartment, just the two of us, and I mentioned I had forgotten a lunch meeting with a client the previous week. It was true. I had written it in the wrong week on my calendar and missed it. I apologized to the client and rescheduled and thought nothing more of it. Cody set down his fork and looked at me in a way I recognized from my investigative years, the careful, measuring look of someone who has already decided something and is now collecting confirmation. He said he was worried. He said he had noticed things. The calendar mistake. The time I had left my keys in the office refrigerator, which I remembered doing and had considered mildly funny. The afternoon I had called him by his cousin's name, which had happened once, in passing, when I was tired. He laid these out the way a junior investigator presents evidence earnestly, with concern visible on his face, as though the concern itself were proof of the conclusion. I told him I was 65 and grieving, and that both of those things could account for a great deal of forgetting. He said he understood. He said he just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I believed him, because the alternative required me to consider something about my son that I was not yet ready to consider. Over the following months, Cody began bringing documents to the office for my signature: partnership amendments, property transfer authorizations, revised operating agreements for 3 of our commercial holdings. He would set them in front of me with a pen already uncapped and say the same thing each time, just routine. Dad. The lawyer already reviewed it. I signed the first 2 without reading them carefully. On the third one, something in the phrasing caught my attention, a clause about successor authority that I did not remember discussing, and I asked him to leave the document so I could review it overnight. He said, of course. His voice did not change. His expression did not change. But when I looked at him, I noticed that he touched the edge of the document once before he let go of it. Just once. Old habit from 31 years, I noticed. That night, I read the document twice. Then I photographed every page with my phone. I began doing that with everything he brought me after that, photographing it before I signed, sometimes photographing it and not signing at all, and telling him I needed more time. He was patient about it. That patience, I would later understand, was because he already had another mechanism in motion that did not require my signature at all. I did not know that Cody had gone to see Dr. Anita Marsh until after the court had already acted. Dr. Marsh had been my physician for 11 years. She was thorough and direct, and had called me personally when Sylvia's first scans came back. She was not a careless woman. What Cody brought her was a guardianship petition, a formal legal document requesting that the court grant him authority over my financial affairs, my property, and my medical decisions, along with what he described as a supporting medical summary. He told her he was deeply concerned about my cognitive decline. He told her the family was struggling. He used, I am told, the word heartbreaking. Dr. Marsh reviewed the summary. She signed the petition. She had no reason to believe that the medical documentation attached to it had been assembled by my son rather than generated by any clinical evaluation of me. The letter from the Multnomah County Circuit Court arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because I had been expecting a different piece of mail, a property assessment for a building on N.E. Glisson, and I opened the envelope without looking at the return address. The letter informed me that a guardianship proceeding had been initiated, that the court had reviewed supporting documentation, and that pending a final hearing, certain limitations on my independent legal and financial authority were now in effect. It said I was no longer considered capable of managing my own affairs. I read it once. I read it a second time. Then I folded it along its original crease and set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee cup. I stood at the window for a moment and looked at the unpainted fence. Then I picked up my phone and called Douglas Fenn. Douglas had been my attorney for 19 years. He had handled 3 contract disputes, 1 property litigation, and Sylvia's estate. When he answered, I told him I had received a letter from the court. I told him what it said. There was a pause on his end, not a long one, but the kind that means a person is recalibrating. Then he said, Walter, I need you to bring me everything. Every document Cody has had you sign in the last year, every piece of paper that's come through that office with your name on it. I told him I already had photographs of most of it. Another pause. He said, "Good. Come in Thursday morning. And, Walter, don't sign anything else." I told him I wouldn't. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for another minute. The fence needed 2 coats. Sylvia had always said, "You couldn't do it in one and have it hold through a Portland winter." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Standard white, no return address that meant anything, just the name of a law firm I didn't recognize, one that had an office on Southwest 5th. I opened it at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on. The letter was 2 pages. I read both pages twice, then set them down and looked at the window. The cherry tree in the backyard was losing its last leaves. Sylvia had planted that tree in 1994, the spring after we moved in. It had never been a particularly impressive tree. She had loved it anyway. The letter informed me that, pursuant to Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 120I, my son Cody Briggs, acting in his capacity as my legally appointed guardian, had executed a transfer of 60% of the outstanding shares of Briggs Commercial Properties, LLC, from my name into his. The transfer had been notarized and filed with the Oregon Secretary of State's office 4 days earlier. It was, the letter explained, entirely legal. A guardian has broad authority to manage the ward's financial assets. The letter was informational, not a request. There was nothing for me to sign. There was nothing for me to contest through the mechanism the letter described. I was being told, not asked. I folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. Then I put the envelope in the drawer where I kept documents I needed Douglas Fenn to see. That was a Thursday. The following Monday, I drove to the office on Northeast Halsey, the one I had leased for 11 years, the one where Sylvia used to drop off lunch on Fridays when she was still well enough to drive. The building manager, a man named Pete Sousa, who had managed that property since before I signed my first lease there, was standing near the front entrance when I arrived. He saw me coming across the parking lot and looked away, not rudely, the way a person looks away when they know something and don't want to be the one to say it. The security guard at the front desk was new. I had never seen him before. He asked for my name. I told him. He typed something, looked at his screen, typed again. Then he said, "Sir, I'm not showing you in the system." I told him I owned the building's primary tenant. He said he understood, but he couldn't let me through without authorization. I asked him whose authorization. He said, "Mr. Briggs." I told him I was Mr. Briggs. He looked at his screen again and said, "The other Mr. Briggs, sir." I stood there for a moment. The lobby had the same smell it had always had, recycled air and the faint trace of the cleaning solution Pete used on the floors. I had walked through that door 4 or 5 days a week for 11 years. I knew where the light fixture on the left flickered when the weather changed. I knew that the elevator stuck between 2 and 3 if you pressed the button too fast. I knew all of it, and none of that knowledge was relevant anymore. Ted Garland was standing in the inner lobby, on the other side of the glass partition. Ted had been a commercial real estate broker in Portland for 22 years. We had worked together on 14 transactions. I had been to his daughter's wedding. He saw me through the glass. I saw him see me. He looked down at the floor. Then the interior door opened and Cody came out. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark navy. Well fitted. He looked, I thought, like he had been expecting me. Maybe he had. He came to the front desk and stood beside the security guard and looked at me with an expression that I had seen him practice since he was 19 years old. Concerned, patient, slightly pained. He said, "Dad, we talked about this. You're not well. You need to rest." His voice was gentle. That was the part I would remember longest, not the words, which were predictable, but the gentleness, the care in it. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that the most effective way to erase a person is to do it quietly, with the tone of someone who loves them. I did not answer him. There were 2 security guards now, the new one at the desk, and another who had appeared from somewhere to my left. Ted Garland was still on the other side of the glass. He had not raised his eyes. I looked at Ted for 3 seconds. He had watched me build that business from a 2-person operation in a shared office space. He had shaken my hand at closings. He knew what I was. He knew what this was. He looked at the floor. I turned and walked back across the parking lot to my car. I did not hurry. I started the engine and pulled out onto Halsey and drove east. About 2 miles out, I pulled into a Chevron station and parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pumps. I sat there for 20 minutes. A woman walked past with a small dog on a leash. The dog stopped and looked at my car. Then they both moved on. I thought about the phrase Cody had used. "You're not well." He had said it in front of a man I had worked alongside for 14 years, in front of 2 people who would repeat it, in front of glass walls that made everything visible to everyone inside. He had said it gently. He had said it as though he meant it. And that was the mechanism, not the guardianship paperwork, not the share transfer, not the letter from the law firm on Southwest 5th. The mechanism was the gentle voice, the concerned expression, the performance of a son who loved his father and was simply trying to help. I had spent 23 years as a private investigator. I had watched people construct false narratives in depositions, in affidavits, in conversations with attorneys who should have known better. I knew what it looked like when a story was being built. I had watched Cody build this one for months, and I had let him, because I needed to understand how far he intended to go. Now I knew. I picked up my phone and called Douglas Fenn. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened at the office. I told him about Ted Garland and the glass partition and the 2 security guards. I told him about the envelope from the law firm, which was already in the drawer. Then I said, "We need to start." Fenn said, "Start what exactly?" I said, "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Renata Voss." He didn't ask me why. He had been a lawyer for 30 years. He knew when a question would be answered in time. I hung up. Through the windshield, the Chevron sign hummed in the gray Portland afternoon. I sat another minute, then pulled back onto the road and drove home. The call came 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, from a man named Gerald Pruitt. Gerald had been a commercial tenant at the Morrison Street property for 7 years, a small architectural salvage business that had never once been late on rent. He said he was calling to check in. He said he had received a letter. I asked him to describe it. It was on Briggs Commercial Properties letterhead. It informed current and former clients that Walter Briggs had stepped back from active management of the company, effective immediately due to ongoing health concerns. It thanked them for their years of business and directed all future correspondence to Cody Briggs, Managing Director. It was signed, at the bottom, with my name. Gerald said, "Walter, I just wanted to make sure you were all right. The letter made it sound like I wasn't sure what it meant." I told him I was fine. I told him the letter did not reflect my situation and that I appreciated him calling. I kept my voice even. He said he was glad to hear it, that he'd figured something was off because I'd always been a straight shooter. I thanked him again and ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment. The letter had gone out under my name to people who had trusted that name for years, telling them I was unwell, telling them I was gone. Cody had not just taken the company. He had taken the version of me that existed in other people's minds and quietly replaced it with someone diminished, someone who needed to be set aside. I went to the drawer and added Gerald Pruitt's name to the list I had been keeping. Then I picked up my keys and drove to Margaret's house. The next morning, I drove to Margaret Cole's house at 7:15. Margaret lived 3 doors down from me on Ashworth Lane, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in that house since her husband built it in 1978. She had known Sylvia. She had brought casseroles after the funeral and never once asked for anything in return. When I knocked, she opened the door. Before I finished knocking, she had seen me coming up the walk. I told her I needed to use her landline. I told her it was a legal matter and that I preferred not to call from my own phone for the time being. She didn't ask why. She stepped aside, pointed to the phone in the kitchen, and went back to her crossword at the table. That was Margaret. 22 years of being neighbors. And she understood, without explanation, that some things were better done quietly. I dialed Douglas Fenn's direct line. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him I needed him to pull the full guardianship filing, not just the summary his assistant had reviewed, but the original documents submitted to Multnomah County. Every page, every exhibit. I told him to look specifically at the medical evaluation report, the one that had been submitted as Exhibit C. I told him to look at the dates. Fenn said he'd have it by end of day. I thanked Margaret on my way out. She was still working her crossword. She said, "You looked like your father just now. Walter. He had that same face when he was working something out." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and walked back down the drive. Fenn called me that evening at Margaret's number, which I had given him. I was sitting in her kitchen again with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, but that she had set in front of me anyway. He said the medical report listed an evaluation date of March 14th. He had pulled my medical records from Providence, Portland, the clinic I had used for 30 years, and there was no appointment on March 14th. There was no appointment that entire week. The last time I had seen any physician at that clinic was February 2nd, a routine follow-up after a minor procedure. Nothing about cognitive decline. Nothing about capacity. The report that Cody had submitted to the court described a man who was confused, who had difficulty recalling recent events, who had shown signs of impaired judgment during examination. The examination had never taken place. Fenn said, "I'm going to call Dr. Marsh in the morning." I said, "Do it from your office. Keep a record of the call." He said he knew. He had been a lawyer for 30 years. He knew. I drove home along Burnside, the city gray and wet the way Portland is in November, and I thought about the date. March 14th. I knew exactly where I had been on March 14th. I had been at the storage unit on Southeast Powell, going through the boxes of Sylvia's things that I still hadn't been able to finish sorting. I had been there from 9 in the morning until almost 2 in the afternoon. The facility had a keycard entry system. Every entry and exit was logged. I had the receipt from the coffee I bought at the gas station on the way home. Cody had chosen a date without knowing that I was the kind of man who kept receipts. That was the first thing I had spent 30 years learning: people who choose dates carelessly because they assume no one is watching. I had spent 30 years watching. Fenn called the following morning. He had reached Dr. Anita Marsh at her clinic on Northwest 23rd. He told me she had gone quiet when he explained why he was calling. Not the quiet of someone caught, the quiet of someone trying to understand what she was looking at. She had asked him to repeat the date. He repeated it. She said she needed to review her own records and would call him back before noon. Fenn said her voice, by the end of the call, was very careful. The kind of careful that comes from a person who has just realized that her name is on something she didn't put it on. She called back at 11:47. Fenn relayed what she said, word for word, because I had asked him to write it down. I did not conduct an evaluation of Walter Briggs on March 14th or at any point in the preceding 6 months. I will need to examine the document you are describing before I can say anything further, but I can tell you that the signature block you read to me does not match my standard format. She had asked Fenn to send her a copy of the exhibit. He had already prepared it. 2 days later, I was in Fenn's office on Southwest Morrison, 3rd floor, the one with the window that looked out over the parking structure, and, if you leaned slightly, a sliver of the Willamette on clear days. It was not a clear day. Fenn's assistant had set out water and a legal pad, and Carol Huang was already seated at the conference table when I arrived. Carol Huang had been the notary at Fenn's firm for 16 years. She was in her early 50s, precise in the way that people who work with documents become precise, not fussy, just exact. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had a habit of removing them and holding them in both hands when she was thinking. She had the original guardianship filing in front of her, the copy that Fenn had obtained through the court clerk's office, and she had my original estate documents from 2019 laid out beside it for comparison. She had been at it for 20 minutes before I arrived. She didn't look up when I sat down. She was studying page 3. I watched her. She moved the reading glasses from her face to her hands and back again twice. Then she set them down on the table and looked up at me. She said, "Mr. Briggs, I need to ask you something directly." I said she could. She said, "Did you sign this document, page 3, the acknowledgement of consent?" I said I had not. She looked back at the page. Then she looked at the 2019 documents, then back at page 3. She said, "I didn't think so." She picked up the glasses again, held them in both hands, and said, the signature on page 3, "It doesn't match your signature on any of the originals from 2019. The letter forms are different. The pressure pattern is different. The loop on the lowercase g in your surname in your originals, you close it. In this document, it's open. She paused. I have been doing this for 16 years. I know the difference between a signature that has drifted over time and a signature that belongs to a different hand entirely. The room was quiet. Fen was writing. I looked at the window. Rain was moving across the parking structure in long diagonal sheets. Carol said, "I'll put that in writing." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Mr. Briggs, whoever signed this, was counting on no one looking closely enough." She said it without heat, just as a statement of fact, the way a person who has spent 16 years looking closely at things says something they have learned to be true. I nodded. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. That afternoon, I asked Fen to tell me everything he had found about Renata Voss. He had a file. He set it on the table between us and went through it, the way he went through everything methodically, without editorializing. Renata Voss, 36 years old, licensed architect, had worked for a mid-sized firm on the east side of Portland for 4 years before going independent 18 months ago. She had met Cody at a commercial real estate event in the spring, 3 years back, the kind of industry gathering where developers and architects and brokers all circulated in the same room and called it networking. She had been living, for the past 14 months, in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District. The lease was held by Briggs Commercial Properties. The monthly payments had been running through an account that was nominally a vendor expense line. I looked at that last part for a moment. Cody had been paying for her apartment out of the company that had been built on 40 years of my work and Sylvia's patience and every deal I had closed in the rain on a handshake. He'd been using it to pay for a life he was running in parallel, and he had signed me away to make sure I couldn't see the books. I told Fen I didn't want to contact Renata directly. He said he understood. I said, "Write her a letter. Keep it short. 1 question." I told him what the question should be. I told him to include a copy of Carol Huang's preliminary findings, not the full report, just the summary paragraph, the one that described the signature discrepancy on page 3. Fen wrote it down. He said, "And if she doesn't respond?" I said, "She will." He looked at me over the legal pad. He had known me long enough not to ask how I was certain. I had spent 30 years reading people not their words, their choices. Renata Voss had been living in an apartment she didn't pay for, in a relationship she couldn't introduce to anyone, watching a man she thought she knew use a document she'd probably never seen to strip his own father of his legal existence. She had been carrying that. I didn't know her, but I knew the weight of what she was carrying because I had watched it in enough people over enough years to recognize it without being told. The letter went out the following Thursday. Fen sent it by certified mail to the Pearl District address and also by email to the professional address listed on her architecture firm's website. He wrote it on plain letterhead, no firm name, 1 paragraph, 1 question, and at the bottom, a single line. Enclosed is a notarized finding regarding the document used to remove Walter Briggs' legal rights. You may want to read it before deciding whether to respond. I didn't know when she would read it. I didn't know what she would do. I drove home that evening on the same route I always drove, past the storage facility on Southeast Powell, past the gas station where I had bought the coffee on March 14th, past the turn onto Ashworth Lane where Margaret's porch light was already on in the early dark. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment. The fence along the left side of the property, the white fence that Sylvia had asked me to repaint the summer before she got sick, was still the same weathered gray it had been for 5 years. I had never gotten to it. I had meant to. There had always been something else. I got out of the car and went inside. I did not call anyone. I made dinner and washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light at 8:30. Then I went to bed and lay in the dark and waited, the way I had learned to wait over 30 years of doing work that required patience as a professional skill rather than a virtue. I had learned one thing clearly in all those years: when you send the right question to the right person at the right moment, you do not have to wait long for the answer. The call came 11 days later. I was at my desk when Fen's name appeared on my phone. I had expected him to call eventually, but I had not expected what he said in the first 30 seconds. He told me a woman named Renata Voss had contacted his office that morning. She had asked to speak with him directly. She had used my name. I set down the pen I was holding. Fenn said she had been brief, on the phone, composed, he thought, in the way of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was determined to say it before they lost the nerve. She told him she had known about the guardianship paperwork from the beginning. Cody had shown her the documents before he filed them. He had told her, in those words, that the old man wouldn't be able to do anything anymore. She had not asked what he meant. She said she hadn't wanted to know. She said she had been telling herself that for a long time and had recently stopped believing it. Fenn asked if I wanted him to meet with her. I told him yes. I told him to take notes on everything she said before she had time to reconsider. He called me again 4 days later from his office on Southwest Morrison. Renata had come in that morning. He said she was 34, that she had worked in commercial property management before she met Cody 18 months ago, and that she had arrived 15 minutes early and waited in the lobby without asking anyone for anything. He said that last detail like it meant something. I understood why. A person who arrives early and waits quietly is either very calm or very frightened. He said she had been the second thing. She had told Fenn what she knew. In order, Cody had brought her into his life quickly, the apartment, the dinners, the introductions to his colleagues. She had been careful, she said, because she was not a careless person, but Cody had a way of making the pace feel natural. By the time she understood what was happening, she had already given up her own apartment and was living in his. After that, the changes had been gradual. He had asked to be added to her phone plan. It was more efficient, he said, to share a family account. Then he had suggested she keep her banking simple and use his credit card for household expenses. Her friends had stopped calling as often. She had told herself that was normal, that relationships changed your social life, that she was simply busy. She had told herself many things. Fenn said she paused at that point and looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, I realized I was sitting in the same chair Walter must have been sitting in when they told him he couldn't manage his own affairs. And I had helped put him there, not directly, but I had known, and I had said nothing. I was standing in my kitchen when Fenn told me this. The window above the sink looked out onto the backyard. The fence was still gray. Fenn asked me if I was still there. I told him I was. I asked him what else she had said. She had said she was willing to provide a formal statement. She had said she understood that Cody would find out and that she was prepared for what that would mean. She had said it without drama. Fenn told me the way someone says a thing they have already decided and do not need to discuss further. He told me he had scheduled a second meeting for the following Thursday. He told me there was someone else he also needed me to come in for. Dr. Anita Marsh arrived at Fenn's office on a Thursday morning in February, 2 years and 3 months after the guardianship order had been granted. She was 51. She had been in family practice in the Beaverton area for 19 years, and she had brought a manila folder with her that she set on the conference table without being asked. Fenn introduced me as the subject of the original evaluation. She looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has spent years delivering difficult information and has learned to hold eye contact while doing it. She said she had received Fenn's letter and had pulled her original records immediately. Fenn opened his own folder and slid a document across the table. It was the medical evaluation that had been submitted to the court in support of the guardianship petition, the document that had described me as cognitively impaired, unable to manage financial decisions, at risk of exploitation, the document that had persuaded a judge that my son needed to make my decisions for me. Doctor, Marsh looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened her manila folder and placed her own copy beside it. The dates did not match. The evaluation submitted to the court listed an appointment date of September 14th. Dr. Marsh's office records showed no appointment for Walter Briggs on September 14th. The appointment in her records, the one she had actually conducted, the one she had actually signed, was dated September 9th. The findings in her original notes were not the findings described in the court document. Her original notes described a man who was alert, oriented, and showed no signs of cognitive decline. The court document described someone else entirely. She said, Very quietly, I did not write this. I signed something, but I did not write this. Fenn set his pen down on the legal pad in front of him. He did not pick it up again for a long time. Dr. Marsh said she had been given documents to review and sign at the end of a long day. She said she had read them, but that portions had clearly been altered between the time she reviewed them and the time they were submitted. She said she had not known. She said that several times, not defensively, but carefully. The way a person speaks when they understand that the difference between knowing and not knowing is the only thing they have left to offer. I looked out the window. Fenn's office was on the 4th floor, and the window faced west, toward the river. The sky was the particular flat white that Portland carries through February like a long habit. I thought about Sylvia. I thought about the morning she had been diagnosed, in a different office, with a different kind of document on a different kind of table. I had sat in that room and held her hand and not said anything useful because there was nothing useful to say. Some things you simply sit with until you understand what they require of you. Dr. Marsh asked what would happen next. Fenn told her he would need a formal affidavit attesting to the discrepancy between her original records and the documents submitted to the court. He told her the affidavit would be filed as part of a motion to reopen the guardianship proceeding. He told her it was possible she would be called to testify. She said she understood. She said she would make herself available. She closed her folder and picked up her bag and left the way she had come in quietly, without ceremony. A woman who had discovered that something with her name on it had been used in a way she had never intended and was now doing what she could about it. Fenn and I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after she left. He said, "We have 3 things now. Carol Huang's analysis of the signature irregularities, Dr. Marsh's original appointment records, and Renata Voss's preliminary statement." He said it the way a builder reads a set of measurements, not with excitement, but with the particular satisfaction of numbers that have come out correctly. He filed the motion to reopen on a Tuesday. The filing included all 3 exhibits, organized and indexed, with a cover brief that Fenn had spent 11 days writing. I had read it twice. It was a precise document. It did not editorialize. It simply laid out what the records showed and asked the court to look at them. The court served Cody with notice 4 days later. I found out because Fenn called me at 7 in the evening to tell me. I was sitting in the living room with the television off. I thanked him and hung up and sat for a while in the quiet. My phone rang 40 minutes later. I looked at the screen. It was Cody's number, a number I had not seen on my phone in 14 months. I watched it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. I thought about what he might say. I thought about the things I might say back. I thought about the night 2 years ago when I had sat in a hospital corridor after a social worker explained to me what the guardianship petition meant and what my options were, and I had looked at the fluorescent light above me and understood that my son had looked at everything I had built and decided that the simplest path was to take it. The phone rang a 4th time. I set it face down on the side table and did not pick it up. I thought about what he might be doing on the other end of that call. Not the legal calculation, I understood that well enough. I thought about the other thing, the thing that is harder to name. Cody had grown up in the house on Dunmore Street. He had sat at the kitchen table while Sylvia helped him with his homework. He had come to me when he was 17 and asked if I thought he was smart enough to do something worth doing, and I had told him yes without hesitation because I believed it. Somewhere between that kitchen table and the courthouse filing on Southwest 5th, he had made a series of choices, each one small enough to seem manageable, until the accumulation of them had become something he could no longer look at directly. I did not think Cody was a man who felt nothing. I thought he was a man who had felt too much of the wrong things for too long and had eventually chosen not to feel anything at all. That is a different kind of problem. It does not make what he did smaller, but it makes it human, which is its own kind of difficult. There was nothing Cody could tell me that I needed to hear. He had said everything that mattered 14 months ago when he had stopped calling altogether, once the guardianship was in place and there was nothing left, as far as he understood it, to negotiate. He had made his calculation. He had been wrong about one variable, that the people around him would stay silent. His mistress had known things he had told her in confidence, in the easy way people tell secrets to someone they believe they own. He had been wrong about that too. I left the phone on the table and went to the kitchen and put on the kettle. While I waited for it to boil, I stood at the window and looked out at the backyard. The fence line was dark in the February evening, just a gray shape against the tree line, the fence that Sylvia had asked me to repaint. The fence I had not gotten to, I thought, in the spring, not as a promise to anyone, just as a fact about what I intended to do when the light came back. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. I arrived at the Multnomah County Courthouse at 8:15 and sat in the third-row gallery with a cup of coffee I'd bought from the cart on Southwest 4th. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax. The overhead lights were the kind that hum just below the threshold of hearing. You don't notice them until the room is very quiet, and then you can't stop noticing them. Douglas Fenn arrived at 8:40 and set his briefcase on the table without looking at me. That was deliberate. We had agreed the previous week that he would not acknowledge me beyond what was necessary. I was not a party to the hearing in any formal sense. The guardianship was in my name, but the petition to review it had been filed by my attorney on my behalf, and today I was, technically, a witness to my own life being returned to me. I had been a private investigator for 22 years. I had sat in more courtrooms than I could count. I knew how to be still in a room and let the room do the work. Cody arrived at 8:50 with his attorney, a man named Greaves, who wore a dark suit and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had won a lot of preliminary hearings. Greaves set 2 folders on the defense table. Cody sat beside him, straightened his jacket, and folded his hands on the table in front of him. He did not look at me. He had not looked at me in 7 months, not since the morning he had walked out of the offices at Briggs Commercial Properties and told the receptionist, a woman named Linda who had worked the front desk for 9 years, that his father was no longer authorized to enter the building. Linda had called me 20 minutes later. She had been crying. I had told her it was all right. It was not all right, but it was not her fault, and those are sometimes the same conversation. Ted Garland was in the gallery when I arrived. I had not expected that. He was sitting in the second row, near the aisle, wearing the same gray suit I had seen him in at a dozen closings over the years. He had not been subpoenaed. He had come on his own. When I took my seat in the third row, he turned and looked at me for a moment. He did not say anything. Neither did I. He turned back toward the front of the room. Greaves opened the proceeding with a statement that lasted 11 minutes. I counted on my watch. He argued that the guardianship established 14 months ago remained appropriate and necessary, that Walter Briggs, 67, had demonstrated a pattern of cognitive inconsistency that placed him and his assets at risk, and that the documented medical assessment supported continued oversight. He cited the assessment twice. He used the phrase "in the best interest of" 4 times. He was smooth. He was prepared. He had a folder of paper and a client who was sitting very straight in his chair and not touching anything. I had watched Cody in rooms before. When he was nervous, he touched things: the edge of a table, the corner of a folder, his own cufflinks. He had done it at his mother's funeral, at the reading of her will, at every difficult meeting I could remember from the last decade. Today he was not touching anything. That was the tell. He thought he had already won. And people who think they have already won go very still, because stillness looks like confidence, and they have confused the two. Fenn rose when Greaves finished. He did not make a speech. He said he had 3 documents to submit to the court and asked Judge Okafor's permission to approach. Judge Raymond Okafor had been on the Multnomah County bench for 17 years. He was a compact man with reading glasses he wore on a cord around his neck, and he had the patience of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the things people did to each other in the name of family. He said yes. Fenn placed 3 documents on the bench. The first was the signature analysis prepared by Carol Huang, the notary who had flagged the guardianship paperwork 6 weeks earlier, a 12-page comparison establishing that the authorization signature on the filed document did not match any signature in my verified records, and that the document had been altered after initial preparation. The second was Dr. Anita Marsh's original clinical notes from the 2 appointments that had been cited in the medical assessment notes that did not support the conclusions in the assessment, and that Dr. Marsh had signed and submitted directly to the court after reviewing the discrepancy herself. The third document was a sworn declaration from Renata Voss. Judge Okafor read the first document, set it aside, read the second, then he picked up the third. He read it through once. He set it down and picked it up again and read it a second time. When he finished, he took off his glasses, held them in one hand, and polished the lenses with a small cloth he kept in his breast pocket. He put them back on. He looked at Greaves. He said, "Counsel, I'm going to ask you to be seated for a moment." Greaves sat. Fenn returned to the plaintiff's table. He did not look at me. Judge Okafor said he wanted to hear from the witness listed in the third declaration. He said her name, Renata Voss. The door on the left side of the courtroom opened. She came in wearing a gray coat, the same one she had worn to Fenn's office 3 weeks earlier when she had sat across from him for 2 hours and said everything she knew. She walked at an even pace. She did not look at Greaves. She did not look at me. She looked at the witness stand, and she walked to it, and she sat down. Cody turned his head. It was the first time in the entire proceeding that he had moved without a reason. He turned and looked at her, and for half a second, not longer, but long enough, his face did something it had not done all morning. I had spent 22 years learning to read the moment a person realizes the room has changed on them. It looks different on different people. On Cody, it looked like a man who had walked into a building and found that the floor plan was not what he remembered. Then he turned back. He set his hands flat on the table. He was very still again. But it was a different kind of still. In the second row, Ted Garland had gone equally still. He was watching Cody with an expression I recognized, not satisfaction, not shock, but the look of a man who has been carrying a version of events that no longer holds. He had looked at the floor the morning Cody walked me out of the building on Northeast Halsey. He was not looking at the floor now. He was watching the front of the room with both hands flat on his knees. And when Judge Okafor vacated the order and spoke the words restoring my legal authority, Ted closed his eyes for 3 seconds. That was all. When he opened them, he looked straight ahead. I did not see his face again until we were in the hallway afterward, where he was standing near the window with his hands in his coat pockets. He said, very quietly, "I should have called you. Walter," I said, "you're here now." He nodded once, and that was the end of it. Fenn conducted the examination. He was brief and precise. He asked Renata how she knew Cody Briggs. He asked how long they had been in contact. He asked whether she had been present during any discussions related to the guardianship filing. She answered each question in a voice that was even and clear and did not waver. Then Fenn asked her about the document. She said that approximately 2 months before the guardianship petition was filed, Cody had shown her a set of papers he said he was preparing. She had read them. She had asked him what they were for. He had explained. She had not said anything at the time because she had not fully understood what she was looking at, and because she had trusted his characterization of the situation. Then he had shown her the filed version, the version that went to the court, and she had noticed that it was different from what she had seen before. Specific language had changed. The medical summary section was different. She had asked him about it. He had told her it was a revision, that the language had been cleaned up by the attorney. She had not said anything. But she had taken a photograph of the original document with her phone. She did not know exactly why. She said, "I didn't know why at the time. I just felt like I needed to." The photograph was time-stamped. It was dated 11 days before the guardianship petition was filed with the court. Greaves cross-examined her for 14 minutes. He questioned her memory, her characterization of the document, her relationship with Cody, her motivation for coming forward. She answered each question. She did not become defensive. She did not become emotional. She said she had come forward because she had received a letter from an attorney explaining that a court document may have been falsified, and that anyone with relevant knowledge had an obligation to provide it. She said she had thought about it for 9 days before she called. Greaves sat down. Judge Okafor looked at Cody for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Briggs." Cody looked up. The judge said, "I've sat on this bench for 17 years. I want to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you understand what the documents submitted this morning establish?" Cody said yes. His voice was flat. Judge Okafor said, "I don't think you do, because if you did, you wouldn't be sitting here today." Greaves leaned over and put his hand on Cody's shoulder and said something close to his ear. Cody did not respond. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. His face was changing, not all at once, but in sections, the way a pane of glass develops a crack from one corner and then spreads without sound until the whole thing has given. Judge Okafor spoke for 4 minutes. He said that the evidence before the court established a material discrepancy between the documentation submitted in support of the original guardianship petition and the underlying clinical record. He said that the signature analysis submitted by the notary Carol Huang raised serious questions about the authenticity of the authorization on the filed document. He said that taken together, the evidence did not support the continuation of the guardianship. He vacated the order. He restored full legal capacity and authority to Walter James Briggs, effective immediately. Then he said that the court was referring the matter to the Oregon State Bar and to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office for review of potential document falsification, and that he expected all parties to make themselves available to investigators. He said it the way a man says something he has said before in other rooms, about other people without heat, without emphasis, as a simple statement of what would now happen. That was the part that stayed with me afterward, not the words, the flatness of them. Fenn walked to the clerk's window at the front of the room. I followed him. The clerk, a young woman named Diane, who had been at her station for the entire proceeding and had not looked up from her work except twice, spread the restoration of documents on the counter and indicated where I needed to sign. I signed 4 pages. My handwriting was the same as it had always been. Steady. A little angular. The signature I had used on contracts and reports and property transfers for 40 years. The same signature that someone had attempted to replicate on a document filed in this building 14 months ago. Diane gathered the pages, stamped them, and handed me my copies. She said, "Have a good afternoon, sir." I told her I intended to. I did not look at Cody when I turned around. I had looked at him enough. I walked out of the courtroom through the main doors, into the hallway that smelled like marble and old radiator heat, and I stood there for a moment with the folder under my arm and let the door close behind me. Renata was in the hallway. She was standing near the window at the far end, looking out at the gray February sky over the West Hills. She had her coat on again. She did not turn around when I came out, but she knew I was there. I walked toward her and stopped a few feet away, and we both looked at the window for a moment without speaking. I said, "Thank you." She said, "I should have called sooner." I said, "You called." She nodded once. Then she picked up her bag from the bench beside her and walked toward the elevator without looking back. I watched her go. I thought about what it had cost her, not in legal terms, not in the abstract, but in the specific weight of walking into a room and saying true things about someone you had trusted, knowing that the saying of them could not be undone. She had known Cody for 3 years. She had believed, for most of that time, the version of events he had given her. The photograph on her phone had been taken on a Tuesday morning in a kitchen in Northwest Portland, in the ordinary way that people record things they cannot yet name but cannot bring themselves to discard. I had spent 22 years in rooms where people told stories, and I had learned that the most important evidence is usually the kind that someone kept without knowing why. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. I walked to the stairwell and took the stairs down to the lobby. 4 flights. The folder under my arm. My footsteps steady on the concrete. Outside on Southwest 4th, the air was cold and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and looked at the street. Then I walked to my car and drove home on the same road I'd been driving for 31 years. The Oregon Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into Cody Briggs 11 days after Judge Okafor's ruling. The charge was document fraud specifically. the falsification of medical assessment records submitted to the Multnomah County Probate Court in support of a guardianship petition. A second charge followed 3 weeks later: abuse of a conservatorship, which under Oregon statute carries its own weight independent of the fraud. Douglas Fenn called me on a Thursday morning to tell me. I was in the kitchen making toast. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch if I needed anything further. He said he thought I probably wouldn't need much more from him. He was right. The court issued a freeze order on Cody's shares in Briggs Commercial Properties within 48 hours of the investigation opening. Not a transfer, not a seizure, a freeze, pending resolution of the criminal matter, which meant the company itself continued operating, which meant the 11 people who worked there continued to have jobs, which was the only part of the outcome I had thought about with any regularity during the 22 months that preceded it. Greaves, the investor Cody had been courting, the man with the portfolio and the handshakes and the lunch meetings I had not been invited to, withdrew from all negotiations the same week the freeze order was filed. His attorney sent a letter. Fenn forwarded it to me. I read the first paragraph and set it aside. Greaves had no obligation to stay and no reason to. He was a businessman. He understood what an open criminal investigation attached to a company's principal shareholder meant for due diligence. I didn't blame him. I had spent too many years watching people make rational decisions in irrational situations to blame anyone for doing the math. Word moved through the Portland commercial real estate community the way it always does, not through announcements, but through the particular silence that falls when people stop returning calls. Within 3 weeks of the investigation opening, Cody's name had been removed from 2 industry committee rosters he had joined in the previous year. A broker I had worked with for a decade mentioned, without being asked, that he had heard Greaves had made several calls of his own after withdrawing, not to damage Cody directly, but to explain his departure, which amounted to the same thing. In a market the size of Portland's, that kind of explanation travels far and arrives before you do. I saw Cody once. In the months before his plea, it was not planned. I was leaving the hardware store on Tacoma Street, and he was crossing the parking lot toward a car I didn't recognize. He was wearing a jacket I had not seen before, not the navy one from the hearing, something older, less fitted. He walked with his head slightly down, the way a person walks when they are concentrating on not being recognized. He did not see me. I watched him reach his car, open the door, and sit for a moment before starting the engine. Just sit. I turned and walked to my own car. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I felt something quieter than that, the particular weight of watching someone discover that the version of themselves they had been building had no foundation under it. Renata Voss left Portland 14 days after the hearing. I know this because Fenn mentioned it in passing. She had given a forwarding address to the court clerk, somewhere in Northern California, a town I didn't recognize. She had no legal obligation to stay, and she had fulfilled everything the court had asked of her. She had testified. She had told the truth. Whatever she did afterward was her own business. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 10 days after the hearing. No return address, but the postmark was Portland. She must have mailed it before she left. The envelope had my name on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She had written one sentence: "I hope you get back what you deserve to have." That was all. No signature, no explanation, no apology, which I had not expected and would not have known what to do with. I read it once, standing at the kitchen counter. Then I folded it along its original crease and carried it to the study, where I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and set it on top of the photograph of Sylvia, the one taken at Cannon Beach in the summer of 1991, the one where she is laughing at something outside the frame and her hair is blowing sideways in the wind off the ocean. I closed the drawer, I went back to the kitchen and finished my coffee. 2 years later, after everything that had happened, after the guardianship petition, after the 22 months, after Renata testified against him in open court, I sometimes thought about what it had cost everyone to arrive at that Tuesday morning with the letter in my hand. Not in terms of money or time, though both had been considerable. In terms of what people had chosen to do when they could have chosen otherwise. Renata could have stayed quiet. Dr. Marsh could have declined to review the files a second time. Carol Huang could have processed the paperwork without looking closely enough to notice the date discrepancy. Every one of them had made a small decision to tell the truth, and those decisions had accumulated into something Cody had not accounted for when he built his plan. He had built it on the assumption that people, when given the choice, would take the easier path. He had been wrong about enough of them. I returned to the offices of Briggs Commercial Properties on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the hearing. The building was on Northwest Lovejoy, a space I had leased in 2003 and renovated twice since then. I had not been inside in 22 months. I parked in the same spot I had used for 19 years, on the street level below the building, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Ted Garland was at his desk when I came through the glass door. Ted had been with the company for 14 years. He was the one who had been standing near the entrance the morning Cody had brought me in to announce the transition of authority, the morning I had watched Ted look at the floor rather than at me. I had thought about that moment more than once in the months that followed, not with anger, with understanding. Ted had a family. He had a mortgage. He had made a calculation that morning, the same kind of calculation people make when the ground shifts beneath them and they are trying to figure out which way to stand. I had made similar calculations in my own life. I knew what they cost. He stood up when I came through the door. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. I crossed the room and held out my hand. He shook it. His grip was firm. That was sufficient. The rest of the staff were in by 9. There were no speeches. I sat in my office, the one with the window that looked out over the Pearl District. The one I had furnished in 2003 with a desk Sylvia had helped me pick out from a shop on Burnside and reviewed the company's financials for the previous quarter. They were in reasonable shape, all things considered. Cody had not been incompetent. That had never been the issue. Cody entered his plea on a Friday in February, 6 months after the hearing, guilty on both counts, document fraud and abuse of conservatorship. The sentence was 18 months of supervised probation and full restitution of company assets, which the freeze order had preserved. Fenn called me that afternoon to confirm. I thanked him again. He said, "Walter, it's been a privilege." I told him I meant it when I said thank you, and I did. I did not go to the courthouse that day. I had thought about it and decided against it. There was nothing I needed to see. I had already seen what I needed to see. 4 months earlier, in Judge Okafor's courtroom, when Cody had turned to look at me from the respondent's table, and I had looked back at him, and neither of us had said a word. That had been enough. Some things do not require a final scene to be finished. Instead, I spent that Friday at the house on Selwood. In the morning, I drove to the hardware store on Tacoma Street and bought 2 quarts of exterior white and a new brush, the good kind, with the angled bristles that Sylvia had always insisted on because she said the cheap ones left streaks. I came home and changed into old clothes and went out to the back garden, where the fence along the property line had been sitting unpainted since the spring of 2019. Sylvia had asked me to paint it that April. I had told her I'd get to it. I had not gotten to it. There had always been something else. And then there had been nothing else at all. And then there had been 22 months of something I would not have chosen. I started at the north end and worked south. The way the light moved, the wood was dry and took the paint cleanly. I worked without music, without the radio, without the phone in my pocket. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that Portland gets quiet on a cold February afternoon, not empty, just settled, people inside behind their windows, the sound of traffic muffled by distance and the particular dampness of the air before rain. I finished the last section at 3:30. I cleaned the brush the way Sylvia had taught me: warm water, then soap, then warm water again, working the bristles against my palm until the water ran clear. I hung it on the hook inside the garage door. Then I went inside and made coffee the good kind, the whole beans ground fresh, the way I had been making it for 41 years, and carried the mug out to the back steps and sat down. The garden was still. The fence was white. I drank the coffee while it was still hot.